Have you ever wondered how you as a beginner can start to craft some of the most powerful decks in the game using your own collection, not spending all of your wildcards? Well, you're in luck. Today we are giving you guys an in-depth guide on how to build an aggro deck based solely around your collection, incorporating principles and procedures that I myself, as a long-term content creator, use every single day in the construction of my decks. Get ready, buckle in. Hey everybody, welcome back. Thanks for taking the time to watch Hello Good Game. We're continuing along with our Magic the Gathering Arena beginner guide. Today is part 2, aggro decks. Yesterday we took a look at all of the different deck archetypes within Magic the Gathering Arena. Control, combo, aggro, mid-range. We even touched on the hybrid strategies as well quickly, which we'll dive into later on in the series once you guys are up to speed. So if you've not checked out all of the different deck archetypes within Magic the Gathering Arena, you're not sure which one suits your needs best, go ahead, start at the beginning of this playlist or this series. Now, before we get started, I want to remind you guys that if you find any value within this video, go ahead and give me a thumbs up and share this to a friend. It's a great way to help my brand grow so we can spread this beautiful content throughout the community. Thank you so much for your continued time and attention. Your support does not go unnoticed. Cheers. To recap what an aggro deck is, aggro is short for aggressive. These decks attempt to reduce their opponent's life total from 20 to 0 as quickly as possible, rather than emphasizing on a long-term game plan. Aggro decks focus on converting their cards into damage. They prefer to engage in a race for tempo rather than a card value-based attrition war. Aggro decks generally rely on creatures for its cumulative source of damage. Aggro decks can quickly overwhelm unprepared opponents and proceed to echo the last bit of damage they need to win the game. Aggro decks also generally have access to disruptive elements which can inhibit the opponent's abilities to respond. Aggro decks plan to deal damage to an opponent until they die, generally ignoring their own life totals completely. The majority of cards in an aggro deck should be able to kill your opponent, and an aggro deck usually needs 8 to 12 1-drops as well as 8 to 12 2-drops. Cheap creatures played early will usually deal at least as much damage as your best burn spells. Creatures and any other cheap permanent damage source are also able to punish your opponent's slow draws. Burn spells are a great way to bolster a deck's damage efficiency because their damage production is so predictable. On the other hand, wildly inconsistent burn spells cannot be valued anywhere near their printed damage, except in extreme cases. An aggro deck usually plays between 20 and 23 lands or non-attacking mana sources. This was a general overview of an aggro deck within Magic the Gathering. If you're looking for a more in-depth explanation, I really recommend starting in part 1 of this series. So with that out of the way, we begin to realize that there are multiple kinds of aggro decks. So let's really break down the different formats of aggro. We have mono-red, we have white weenies, we have mono-black, mono-green, mono-blue, and Gruul. We could go further on and begin to incorporate things like Rakdos, Boro, but again, these are more advanced archetypes, and I wanted to keep the beginner guides as simple as possible. We could rabbit hole and go into the most advanced aggro decks. However, with a fresh collection, you really want to keep it simple, keep it slow, and evolve out from there. Red is the color most traditionally associated with aggressive decks in Magic. It has small, powerful creatures and access to direct damage. In fact, red is so good at aggro that it doesn't even need another color to pair with. Mono red, also known as red deck wins, is an archetype we regularly see pop up across all formats, whether it be standard, historic, or limited. It is quick, it is fast, and it is very powerful. However, it doesn't have a monopoly on the archetype. The second most popular color option for aggressive decks is white, which can also be played alone. We see this deck building strategy used in what we call white weenie decks. These decks play lots of small creatures, sometimes making use of the token or go wide strategies, and use pump spells, board wipes, and exile effects to help out late game. In fact, the first ever true aggro decks was white weenies played by Tom Champlain in 1996 World Championship. Absolutely incredible. Black is interesting because it can be both aggressive and controlling. Black-red is a popular aggro combination, and it was backbreaking in return to Ravnica drafts, thanks to the aggro player's dream mechanic, Unleash. Black gives access to small creatures such as zombies, but more importantly, gives you access to a ton of removal, After all, your creatures might need a little bit of support to kill blockers. It's also an aggro all-star when paired with white and red. However, this comes into the more advanced strategies where we're combining 2 and 3 colors in the hybrid strategies. So black can be incredibly aggressive. It can sacrifice its own creatures. It can bring things back from the grave. So it's a very cool archetype for aggro decks. Like black, green is a good support color for aggro decks. Traditionally, green helps out by providing creatures with solid power and toughness, stats, and +1/+1 counters. It also has easy access to trample, which can be a great way to get your damage through to your opponents. Blue? That's right. Even blue can be an aggro deck. It does shift a little bit away from direct aggro unless you're playing Merfolk, but again, now we're looking at a dual and 3 color decks. Merfolk is best played within Simic, and we're going to be talking more about the dual color decks later on. So mono blue tempo is still a cousin of an aggro deck, which is incredibly powerful right now, both in historic, both in standard. Blue decks focus on putting out small creatures to use chip damage on your opponent while controlling the board state with counters to your opponent's creatures and then draw states if you don't need to counter. So blue is typically an aggro's worst nightmare. However, it itself can even be fine-tuned to an aggro strategy. You've picked your deck archetype. You've now picked your sub-archetype, whether it be mono-red, white weenies, etc. Now it's time to begin crafting your dream aggro deck. Open up your client and let's pick a card to start building our whole deck around. I like to just go with what's fun. It doesn't have to be ultra competitive. Just go where the magic leads you, right? So let's get into our game client. Let's throw it up and let's pick a card together. We've loaded up our client. Now we're going to pick a card to build around. I've chosen mono red just from the sheer power and consistency of the deck archetype. One of my favorite mono red cards right now to build around is Anix, Harden in the Forge. This is an absolute beast. His power is equal to your devotion to red, which can be stacked, and then we can put something like Embercleave on him, give him double strike and trample. So we picked our main card, and now we're going to begin building around it. This is a very nice combo. Now, how can we fill it up? How can we get all of the red devotion there? Castle Embereth is another great pick. And now let's just go through and look at some of the red cards. Fervent Champion is amazing, right? We really like that. Cavalcade of Calamity fits in with the deck quite nice as well. Scorched Bitter is a supporting card. And now it may seem like I'm rattling these off and going very quickly, but just keep in mind how much experience I have with my own collection. And now when you are going through your collection, some of the most important work you can do is familiarizing yourself with all of the cards that you have, right? Because there are a lot. So you don't want to be missing out on anything too cool. We have the Pyroling, which is actually a new addition, which is really cool. The Dodger is unblockable, so that's really cool in a form of aggro as well. Let's not forget a little bit of Draw Engine. Through Light Up the Stage, we don't mind that as well. And because it's not a budget deck, we're just rattling it off. Let's go ahead and get a little bit of Torbrand in there as well. I quite enjoy that. Are we balanced? Do we have enough 1-drops? I don't think so. So we always do like to pull up our mana curve and look at our 1-drops, our 2-drops, our creatures to non-creatures. And we're going to be going through these ratios as a wrap-up because we do want to construct our decks first. And then once the deck's constructed, we're going to fine-tune it, make sure that we're balancing the land, balancing the mana curve, etc., etc. So first out of the gate, we just really like to build the deck. And it's always okay, especially in our case, to overfill your deck and then trim it back a little bit later. So just kind of looking for cards that we like. Forbidden Friendship for 2 could be quite a nice card here as well. Maybe getting rid of the Pyroling for us, potentially. And again, you could fit some forms of removal, whether you want that or not. Typically, we just go full out aggro here and not worry about it at all. And really, we're looking pretty good. We're sitting on 24 land. we're going to be playing best of one today, and I really recommend that you always trim a land if you're playing best of one. So sitting on 23 here, down to 22, I think that looks a little bit better. And now we can begin to fill our deck out a little bit more, whether it be through the pyroling, which could be good, but I'm really just looking to flood the deck with 1/1s. So now that we've got our deck built, let's begin to break it down and look through it. Our own strategy through building is to find our first card that we're building around. In this case, it was Annex Hardened in the Forge. Annex power is equal to your devotion to red, so we want to be stacking as many red mana symbols on the field as we can. Whenever Annex or another non-token creature you control dies, create a 1/1 red satyr creature token with this creature cannot block. If the creature's power is 4 or greater, create 2 of those tokens instead. So we're going to be creating the 1/1 tokens on the side of his devotion. The 1/1 tokens bring us into Torbrand. If a red source you control would deal damage to an opponent or permanent that our opponent controls, it deals that much damage +2. So this will make all of our 1/1 tokens hit as 3/1 tokens, which is really cool. Torbrand also has synergy within our First Strike, Fervent Champion, and Grim Initiative. So that'll make them a 3/1 with First Strike, which is cool. The chip damage from Scorch Spitter now gets exemplified as well, doing 3 damage instead of 1. Tin Street Dodger is a unblockable 3/1 at that point. So you can see just how powerful Torbrand is within the deck. Next up, we have Embercleave. This is a 6-drop with flash, so typically not something you see in an aggro deck because it's so expensive. However, this spell costs 1 less to cast for each attacking creature you control. When Embercleave enters the battlefield, attach it to a target creature you control, and equipped creature gets +1/+1 and has double strike and trample. That's absolutely incredible. Let's keep in mind it has 2 red mana symbols for the devotion, plus it gives a +1/+1. So when we equip our Embercleave onto an Annex, Annex gets +3 and first strike, and double strike and trample. So that is incredibly powerful there. We're flooding the field with 1/1s to make use of our Cavalcade of Calamity. Cavalcade of Calamity does 1 damage per attack that we have with a power with 1 or less creature. That is also exemplified through Torbrand, because the 1 damage now becomes 3. And then to seal the deal, we have a little bit of Light Up the Stage, which is just going to help us draw. If you found that the land total was too heavy, maybe 22 land was too much for you in best of 1 with this deck, I'd trim a land and add another Light Up the Stage just to make the draw a little bit more consistent, making sure you're finding your Torbrand, making sure you're finding your Embercleave. And now a really good strategy within this deck is to not play your Torbrand with Annex on the field, but to wait until they use a removal spell like Shatter the Sky to wipe your whole field. Now you get a whole field of 1/1s. Your opponent passes priority to you. It's your turn. You play Torbrand. Boom. You go nuclear and win the game. So we picked an aggro archetype. It was mono red. We picked a card within the archetype to build around. It was Annex. We filled in all of our supporting roles and synergies with the devotion, with the double strike and trample, and then with Torbrand's super duper ability on top of most of our deck, like the Cavalcade, like the chip damage, the unblockables, right? And now we're going to select spells that give us an additional little bit of reach to make sure that we can kill our opponent. In this scenario, we've already done this. It's Embercleave. Embercleave gives double strike and trample and can be cast at flash speed, which is during combat. So your opponent probably won't know it's coming unless he's really used to the meta. And that may be the case because Embercleave is a very powerful and overplayed card right now. So he probably will see it coming. However, this is the exact kind of card style that we're talking about when we add in a little bit of reach to the deck, because your opponent only needs 1 life to win the game. Lots of times with aggro decks, you burn out to turn 5. It's nice to just have maybe a Shock, maybe a Bone Crusher Giant, a Lightning Strike, something that just does a little bit more damage. We can begin to overview it and make sure that it's going to run exactly the way we want it to. I've pulled up here an aggro mana curve. Now, it doesn't have to match this exactly, but I just wanted to demonstrate to you how you can see the 1-drops and the 2-drops are the most prevalent within the deck. We have those stacked up so we can play multiple cards per turn and just kind of empty our hand onto the field. We still have a few 3-drops and even fewer 4-drops and probably little to 0 5-drops, right? So a lot of low cost cards within aggro decks. And then I have the deck details for the Mono-Red Aggro deck that we just built. We're sitting on an average mana cost of 2.2, and then I've got the curve on screen there as well. So you can see it's a little bit different than the example curve, but you'll see the commonality in the fact that the majority of the cards are 3 converted mana cost and less, which means a quick, aggressive style of play. Once we've finished our land, we've balanced it. We're down to 19 mountains and 3 Castle Empress, making things just a little bit faster paced. We found that we didn't need a ton of land within testing, so we trimmed it back, and then we included a few more Castle Empress just for an additional bit of damage output potentially. Next, we want to form a game plan. What does our turn 1 look like? What does our turn 2 look like? What does our turn 3 look like? And how are we winning the game on turn 4? Obviously, our opponent will have some form of disruption, which can hinder that game plan, but we still want to plan opportunistic and ideally towards victory. So turn 1 with this mono red deck seems very easy. We can play any 1-drop. Personally, in my eyes, I like to play cards that don't have haste first, because the creatures with haste can come out and attack quite quickly on turn 2 or turn 3 without summoning sickness. So I really like to get the creatures who don't have haste out first, like the Scorch Spitter, like the Grim Initiate. Turn 2, we are doing that exact same process again. We're playing 2 1-drops this time, or potentially a 2-drop. Now this deck has Cavalcade of Calamity as a 2-drop, however it's not a creature, it doesn't have summoning sickness. As soon as it hits the field, it's active. So I like to hold this card kind of in the back burners and play it only once I need to, and probably have lethal. So we're into Forbidden Friendship. That is an ideal 2-drop because we're dropping 2 creatures on turn 2 almost regardless, because we only have 1-drops and Forbidden Friendship, which drops 2 creatures. So turn 1, creatures. Turn 2, creatures. Turn 3, 100% Annex Harden in the Forge. This card is a beast. If your opponent wipes the field, he's going to make more tokens for you. And then on turn 4, if our opponent didn't wipe the field, we win the game with Embercleave because we have enough attackers to cast it for a cheap enough cost to attach it to our Annex. If he does wipe the field, we play Torbrand, and now all of our 1/1 creatures can kill our opponent that way. So you can see how easily we were able to map out a turn 1, a turn 2, a turn 3, and a turn 4, which will lead to our victory. Now I know that our opponents will have disruption, and it might take us into turn 5 potentially. However, mono red deck is about the consistency of repetition. When you run 100 games in 1 hour with mono red and come out with a win rate of 60%, I feel that you're leaps and bounds ahead of running a control deck and only playing 1 match an hour, and then you're still running at around a 60%. So it's a little bit different, and the amount of rank you can climb with mono red aggro or any aggro deck in general is incredible. Now, I don't only recommend mono red for ranked for beginners, both in standard and historic, but within the constructed and historic events as well. Mono red is a great place to begin farming cards for your collection. It's a very easy deck to build, and it performs very well. It doesn't consist of a ton of mythics and only a few rares, so it's very good value for what you get. Now that we've done our deck, we've made our game plan, we want to begin to test it in the play queue and begin adjusting it as we see fit. We did this a little bit already through the adjustments of our Castle Empress and Mountains. However, I feel that we may want to drop our Forbidden Friendship for some more 1-drop creatures that are non-token, since whenever a non-token creature dies, we create the 1/1 token Satyr, but if a token creature dies, we don't get the 1/1 Satyr, so there might be a little bit of room for improvement with Forbidden Friendship. We're going to have to see how it performs and then adjust from there. Once we've played the deck a whole bunch and adjusted it, we can begin to build a sideboard and start looking at playing traditional ranked, traditional historic, right? Which is a lot of fun. So we begin to incorporate things into our sideboard that we can't deal with our main board. Potentially our opponent has some flyers that we need to deal with, and now Fry comes to mind. So this also depends on your collection, what you have access to, but only sideboard things that you can't compete with normally. For example, maybe you're getting hit with a lot of field removals and you need some early game draw to ensure that you're always playing your Annex before Shatter the Sky. It's really going to depend on the current meta at the time. However, if you're interested in building a sideboard we're going to have a complete sideboard guide for you guys as part of our upcoming series, Magic the Gathering Arena Guides for Beginners. It's a little bit more in depth than I'm willing to get into today. However, my general rule is put in things that will help you win the matches that you have the hardest time winning. So we talked a little bit about what an aggro deck is. Then we explored the different kinds of aggro decks. Then you got the pleasure of building your first aggro deck alongside me, one of the legendary content creators on YouTube for Magic the Gathering Arena. I've built over 500 decks, so you should be able to use some of these principles and incorporate them in your future deck builds. To recap, aggro decks plan to deal damage to an opponent until that opponent dies, generally ignoring their own health points totally. The majority of cards in an aggro deck should be able to kill your opponent. An aggro deck usually needs 8 to 12 1-drops, along with 8 to 12 2-drops. Cheap creatures played early will usually deal at least as much damage as your best burn spells. Creatures and other cheap permanent damage sources you control should be able to punish your opponent if they do slow draws or maybe tapped lands, something like this. On the other hand, while the inconsistent burn spells with huge damage outputs and huge mana costs can be very expensive and overvalued, except in extreme cases, an aggro deck usually plays between 20 and 23 lands or non-attacking mana sources. I hope that these general guidelines and bullet points help you gain an understanding of exactly what an aggro deck entails within Magic the Gathering Arena and whether or not you're interested in playing one in the future. So what do you think? Is aggro the archetype for you? Are you interested in building an aggro deck to move forward? And if so, what colors do you plan on using? And potentially what color combinations are you going to use? If you are using dual color decks, I have to give you guys a warning. Make sure to incorporate the shock lands, the tapped lands, the triomes, any multicolored lands. They're really going to up the consistency of the dual color decks. And I'm trying to stay a little bit away from that for now because you guys are beginners and you're going to want to be spending your rare wildcards on cool creatures, not lands. And I get that. I was there. However, I really recommend that you buy the rare lands, and that's going to really open up different doors for you guys to start playing some of these more advanced archetypes. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate your continued time and support. Tomorrow we are back looking at control decks. How do you build a control deck? What's in a control deck? How are we going to make it work with your collection? Now, this is one of the more advanced archetypes, but I don't think that we'll have any issues with it. Thanks for watching, you guys. I really appreciate your continued time and attention. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share this video to a friend if you think they'll find any value within it. And don't forget to hit that bell icon so you're notified of all of our future uploads, including more series parts of this Magic the Gathering Arena Guide for Beginners. Take care, and I appreciate your support. Peace.
Nice.